Hello there. I think you can see me. There's always a little bit of a delay, but it looks like it's working. You're joining me in my kitchen. I think this is slightly at an angle. I shouldn't have told you that because now you're going to notice it. You know what? I'm going to change it. Give me 1 second. Oh, crap. Okay, I think that's better. I don't know. Thank you for joining me for week 4 of Atheism for Lent. I see some people are watching live. If you're watching live, feel free to ask any questions you want in the chat box. Also, just use it to chat and comment and critique. But if you've got a question, put a Q on it, and I will look at them at the end. What else should I tell you? Well, so this is week 4 you're about to go into. You're doing very well. Congratulations. This is basically, I guess, this is the middle of the course. If you've lasted this long, very good. We have about, I think we have over 300 people doing this this year. So you're with a lot of other people. And if you're on the WhatsApp group, there's lots of conversations happening. So you're not alone in this journey. And my job, as I've said before, is to be a guide through this journey. And of course, not just a guide, as if I am coming to something like Mount Everest. No, I have also molded the mountain that we're climbing. And I've molded it in such a way that really by the end of Atheism for Lent, my hope is that you actually have a very deep and profound experience of dialectics, of a certain movement in philosophy, and whether or not you're able to articulate that or anything doesn't matter, is that you'll have experienced it and gone through it. And you'll have lots of interesting material you can go back to and look at. But okay, anyway, I want to get into this week's material. I'll obviously contextualize it. So let's begin with the first week. Okay, the first week was, if we can say that every science has an object, right? You know, like, now it's difficult for me to think of one, but biology, biological organisms, chemistry, chemicals, molecules and whatnot. And so different sciences have different objects of study. And you could say and I'm using science in the broad sense of the term, the old-fashioned sense of the term, but the science of theology, the object is, you know, God. What is this? It kind of lies at the very center of this theological tradition. So in the first week, there was the idea that this signifier God, this object at the very heart of Christianity, can be spoken, right? So we can say something of this God. We can know that God exists. Let's just start with that, right? God exists. And those were the 5 ways of Aquinas. You also saw Descartes' ontological argument. So again, if you remember the 3 main arguments for the existence of God, there's the cosmological arguments. There's a whole pile of them, and they're all about the existence of the cosmos. The teleological argument. The teleological argument are set of arguments. They all come from the seeming order of the universe. And then the ontological arguments, they arise out of the very definition of God. So we did that. And then the second week, we looked at the standard atheist critiques of this. So in week 2, there was a series of thinkers who were all basically saying things about how logically incoherent the notion of God is, how our mind can't conceptualize those kinds of questions. We also had how the very definition of God is so slippery that it becomes meaningless. So we saw all of these different critiques of God. So that was the first negation of this affirmation of God. So the first negation was week 2, saying this God that you're speaking of is logically incoherent, insufficient, not enough evidence, etc., etc. Then you hit week 3. And week 3 is where the mystics say, exactly, of course, when we use the word God, we are literally referring to something that cannot be referred to. we're literally using a concept that is defined as something that cannot be conceptualized. So the very definition of God is that God cannot be defined, right? So the mystics are going, oh, this is great, week 2 is brilliant. They're going like the atheistic critiques are exactly what is needed within theology to prevent idolatry. Because every time we think we understand what this word means, we are reducing God to an idol, to an object that reflects ourselves. And so the mystics talked about, as we looked at, they use various terms that it might be excess, it might be saturation, it might be hyperpresence. These are the types of terminology that you find within the mystical corpus. It's a very kind of like sense in which we are overwhelmed by something that we cannot grasp. Hence it will, when we conceptualize it, will fall into contradictions and paradoxes and impossibilities, because this is a signifier, a privileged signifier, to signify what cannot be signified. And it cannot be signified because we have been overwhelmed by something that we can't even experience. So even the term experience is one that is used in a very precise way in mysticism. There's someone like Marion talks about counter experience instead. So it's not like so much you experience something as you are overwhelmed by something that you cannot fully experience. You can only, it's like looking at the sun and going blind, right? It's too much. And so actually you go blind, you've got a negation because there's too much hitting your iris. Right? So that's kind of the mystics. So this is an interesting negation of the negation, which literally takes the atheistic critique, says this is spiritual purification, and a lot of great atheistic critiques came out of the theological tradition for precisely that reason. And the mystics would say, you have to continually, as a spiritual practice, right? People do meditation, people do yoga, whatever, but in terms of this radical theology thing, a spiritual practice will be to sit down with an atheistic critique and to really listen to it and to walk through it and to let it do its work within you. And from this perspective of the mystics, that is an act of purifying yourself. It's an act of spiritual purification, right? Which is very different from, again, what you might see on YouTube or something like that, where, say, the theist and the atheist are enemies and they're fighting back and forth. This is not that at all. This is the mystic, not even in a patronizing way, going, oh, I'll pretend to listen to your critique. They're actually going even further. They're kind of saying, well, no, because there are some atheistic critiques, like Mackey, who basically says, I'm not critiquing every definition of God, right? I'm critiquing certain definitions, but people will always be able to come up with new ones, and I can't in advance say that, you know, my argument will work against every conception of God, right? The mystics come in and they say, no, there is no conception of God that cannot be critiqued, that should not be critiqued, that is not wrong, because by definition, the concept of God refers to something beyond conception. Okay, so that's the mystical thing that you explored. You had lots of really good people, all people that you can explore more deeply, and you can look at other thinkers. If you're looking for a really philosophically deep reflection on the mystics, I always recommend Jean-Luc Marion, M-A-R-I-O-N, Jean-Luc Marion. He's a difficult thinker at times, but well worth reading. Okay, so now we come on to what I'm calling here the material critique. And you've kind of gone through the first set of affirmation, negation, negation of negation. So there's this 3-part dance. So now you've gone through one iteration of it. You're about to go through a second iteration of it. But this week 4 can be seen as a negation of the mystics. And you can think of this in a number of ways. And my job is, I can't say everything. There's too much to put into even this long course. You know, there's so much more I could say, right? But my job is to shine a light that illuminates something that would otherwise, you know, be in darkness. So I'm trying to structure this course to bring out as kind of central insights into this theological journey and what parotheology is. And each week is a step, but each step has a number of thinkers that are all very rich in and of themselves. So what I'm trying to do here is set up each step. So what can I say about step 4 that you're about to go into? Basically, okay, so you know that last week the mystics are basically going, yeah, God is a type of fundamental mystery, an ontological unknowing, a reality that is supra, that is hyper being, that overwhelms us. And so all religion is at best a response to that, a poetic response to in the wake of God, right? So religion doesn't describe the source, rather it is a worshipful response to that source, potentially a way to alphabeticize that event, to try to navigate it, to orient your life around it, right? So that's what kind of religion is. But at its core, as I say, the mystics are saying religion arises out of this fundamental overabundance. Now then, the materialists come along, and Feuerbach is probably he's the start of this. And he's writing just after Hegel. He's writing, it's at the 18th century, roughly, into the 19th. I have to double check my timings there, should have looked that up. But he's kind of writing after Hegel, and an absolutely brilliant thinker, very enjoyable to read. Really recommend him. I was almost going to do a master's on him, but he's not that significant. He's a very significant bridge figure in philosophy. And what he argued is, at one point he basically said, okay, maybe there are a few people who have had this overwhelming experience, this hyper-presence, this saturation. They've encountered this fundamental drowning in an event, in the sublime, right? Maybe. But he says, the vast majority of people who call themselves religious and who talk about God, that is not their experience ever, or if it is, it's very rare, and it's not their everyday experience of religion and of how that word is used. So Feuerbach, in a way, is not offering an atheistic critique of this idea, but he's going to offer, one, an alternative reading of where God comes from, and two, one that is, if not universally true, then true for the vast majority of people. So what Feuerbach does, and this bit that I'm about to talk about is the less important part of Feuerbach, but I still think it's important, because Feuerbach prefigures people like Freud, Nietzsche, Marx, right? In that all of these thinkers were really good at drawing out why people are religious, of what function it has, because I sometimes call this the functionalist week, the functional critique, because they look at where does religion come from and what is its function, whether good or bad or somewhere in the middle or both, right? And for Feuerbach, he said, well, God, for the vast majority of people, arises out of a type of failure, a type of lack. And in a way, he argues that, like, we have hopefully loving parents when we're young, but they can never be wholly loving, wholly there, and sometimes they die, all of that. And so it's very natural for us to imagine a parent who loves us unconditionally, will never die, will never betray us. And also in a world which is very chaotic, and there's a lot of things can go wrong, illnesses, attacks from enemies, etc., famines or whatever, it's very, and we do have people to protect us when we're young. You know, you have people who'll protect you, but they can never do a full job and can never protect you from all illness and all attacks. So again, it's perfectly natural for people to imagine some being that would be able to protect completely and totally. And so Feuerbach is saying, in the same way that if you're in a desert and you need water, you can hallucinate an oasis. in the same way, we as human beings, to greater and lesser extent, but universally, all of us feel this to some extent, is a lack of protection and a lack of love causes us to want, very naturally, a source of love and protection that we'll never feel. So Feuerbach offers, I just did that in brief, but it offers a very, persuasive way of thinking about that God arises from this lack, this failure. And I'll give you an example of this. I have a couple of friends who are going through a really difficult time with an illness, unexpected illness. Now, my friends are not religious in any confessional sense at all, but they have asked all of their friends to pray for them and to pray for the person who's ill, to keep them all in prayer and thought. And they are praying as well. And in a way, this is not good or bad. I mean, it's good in a way. But it's that religious impetus that is expressing itself is not coming from an encounter with some superabundant hyper presence, right? That kind of overwhelms us like DMT or something, right? It is an experience of helplessness. It's a profound experience of helplessness in the face of suffering that turns into, I think, very heartfelt, genuine request for prayer and prayer themselves. So that's Feuerbach would say. This is what happens. The feeling of helplessness, the feeling of a lack of love, the feeling of a lack of knowledge as well. These are all things that the word God can offer a potential covering of the wound. And this is interesting because for Feuerbach, and this is going to be important, this is going to mark an important thing that we will pick up in a couple of weeks in a deeper way. But it's not the beginning of lack, because the mystics have a sense of lack that comes from excess. You have a lack of knowledge because you're overwhelmed, right? You have your doubt, your unknowing doesn't come from ignorance, it comes from kind of like an overwhelming experience. So there is a lack there, right? But Feuerbach now radicalizes that, he negates the lack. And so now the lack is a real lack. It's a real sense of, I feel helpless in the face of the world. And now I find myself compelled to pray. Nietzsche actually adds an interesting one to this as well. Nietzsche says that sometimes the God can come around because we want to say thank you. That life is going so well that you want something to say, to worship and praise for what good is happening. So Nietzsche was a little bit critical of just seeing religion always arising from lack. He did see that happening and he was critical of that. But he said there is a religion that comes from affirmation. But even that is a type of lack, because even that is, you feel you need someone to thank, right? You can't just accept what's happening. You feel you're lacking some other to acknowledge, to see, to recognize and legitimize what is happening. So we have this notion that, and it's called a materialist critique because it says basically God comes materially out of our historical situation. It doesn't fall from above, it arises from our trying to live in society. And Feuerbach would still, say happily, maybe God exists, first of all, who knows, right? So there's no critique of God in Feuerbach in that way. There's no argument against the existence of God. God might exist. He also is like, hey, if you've had that mountaintop experience, great, go for it. But he says, but when you look at the word God and you look at religion seriously and historically, you see that it arises out of our material conditions and out of our, say, lack of knowledge, our helplessness, our feeling of not being loved. And it's a lack that generates an excess. This is really a key point. And again, it's something that I will come back to in a couple of weeks, but I'll mention it briefly now. So there's, say, for example, a lack of knowledge. You don't know how the universe started. And so you say God did it, right? That gives you a sense sometimes of what I would want to call surplus knowledge, right? Which is not just you kind of think you know something or you've got some good information. It can sometimes make you feel like you've got hyper knowledge, like you know more than physicists and cosmologists and all of that, right? You have a deep insight into the nature of reality. So weirdly and interestingly, this lack of knowledge, when it's given the name God, is experienced as an excess, as a type of knowledge that a scientist would, could only dream of, right? That you can have with this word. So interestingly, the lack generates an excess. The lack of knowledge generates the feeling of an excess of knowledge or an absolute certainty that is kind of not exactly true, right? God is not in itself an answer to a question, right? It can be a way of a placeholder or something like that. So what we have then with Feuerbach is the beginning of an alternative description of the word God that doesn't come from above, but arises from material historical circumstances. Again, it's not a critique of God, because Feuerbach would say, well, maybe there is a God, whatever. That's not what he's interested in. He's interested in people who use the word God. How is it functioning? What is it doing? Now, that's how I want to loosely group the thinkers that you're going to experience this week, because all of them are interested in what religion does and how the word God is used, how it arises historically and what its function is. And they are not interested in some absolute critique of some being out there in the world. They'll leave that to the mystics and they'll leave that to reality. They're interested in religion and God concretely understood. Now, the first thinker you're going to meet, because you're going to go from people who think this is a great thing to people who think that religion's a terrible thing. So you start with Feuerbach, who calls himself a friend of the theologians. He sees himself, he is very well theologically trained. He knows Luther inside out. He's a philosopher, one of those philosophers who is deeply well read in theology. So you start with him, and then you end with Emma Goldman, who really, really hates religion and Christianity and has a very powerful diatribe against it. And you'll have everything in between. So you get a good feel for this. But what Feuerbach does is he again is a brilliant precursor of Freud here, because he basically gives a systematic understanding of what today we call projection, where he says that God is a screen, right? A screen that's created through lack, right? We have this sense of a lack of knowledge, a lack of security, a lack of love. And on that lack, we put up a screen, and then we project onto that screen something of ourselves. And so Feuerbach says that in order for humanity to come to know their own essence, what it is to be human, right? At its core, what it is to be human. In order for you to do that, you have to first project your essence out onto a screen. It's seen there, writ large. Then you have to realize that that is a reflection of the human community. And then you have to take it back and live into it yourself. In a very basic way, it's like the phrase, we are the ones we are waiting for, right? So you project out onto God all these things about justice and love and mercy and order and progress. And then you realize, oh, those are our highest ideals. We are the ones who have to bring that into the world. So Feuerbach sees this as an absolutely necessary development of human history. And he's connected to Hegel here and then later to Freud. And the idea is that in order to stabilize society, to come to understand oneself, religion is a necessary step. That's why it's universal. Anthropology finds it everywhere, right? Because we have to, in order to come to know ourselves, start with an image out in the world that we then take back. Freud developed this in terms of projection. Lacan, in an even deeper way, called it the mirror phase, which is when the infant kind of misrecognizes themselves. He's slightly different from Feuerbach, but sees themselves in the mirror and is able to conceptualize themselves as an object in the world, as a person, whatever, and then take back that image into themselves. So they feel weak and fragile and can't really do very much, but they look in the mirror and the mother says, look how strong you are, look how beautiful you are, look how wonderful you are. And you look at that mirror image with all of these positive things that are being said about it, and then you take it back into yourself. Now already you might notice that there's slight difference there between what Feuerbach's saying and what Lacan is saying. Because what Feuerbach is saying is that what we see in the mirror of God is our essence. It's not a misrecognition. We see ourselves in an idealized form, but everything we see in God is a reflection of our own abilities and our own possibilities. And so again, he calls himself the friend of the theologians, and he says that theology is anthropology. Right? And by that he says that when you look at theological stuff, it's telling you about anthropological stuff. And when you do things like, drink wine and eat the wafer as communion, he says what religion at its best wants to do is wants to turn that into real sustenance for everybody. There's these rituals within Christianity that speak to universal themes. Right? Then Marx comes along and he says, basically, Feuerbach, absolutely brilliant, gets this right. But Marx adds an interesting and important point and kind of offers one very important critique to Feuerbach. Because what Marx says is, and this is the beginning of ideology critique, is Marx says that religion doesn't really tell you about the essence of humans. It tells you about the values of the society that religion is in. It tells you in idealized form the social relations, right? So it's not some eternal objective human essence. What religion does is it kind of takes the values of the ruling class and it makes them eternal and it gives them a divine sheen. And this does a number of things. One is, Marx says, it's an opiate. It's a painkiller. Like religion makes life easier for people who are being really oppressed in this world, who have jobs that don't give them any form of creativity or satisfaction. They're working for others. They're spending their labor to make others rich, et cetera, and they have very little time for their own creative enterprises and their own way of exploring the world. All of that. But religion can offer a way of coping with that, right? It can provide a way of being able to bear the weight of that. And Marx is very sympathetic to that. But he ultimately says that the problem here is that it prevents action. And he has a beautiful image. And the image is, which you'll read this week, he says, religion is the imaginary flowers on the chains of our oppression. We must get rid of the imaginary flowers, not so that we see the chains and despair, but so that we can break the chains and pick living flowers. So it's a really lovely image where he says, we have this oppression, religion covers over that oppression, and that makes us feel better. But when we critique religion, and he goes, it's painful. It's like doing an intervention with someone who's an alcoholic. It's painful. Like when you're telling them not to drink, you're doing something horrible, right? Because they're drinking for a reason, right? They're drinking because there's stuff they don't want to face, they don't want to look at. And so by you saying you need to knock the alcohol on the head, in one way you're doing something horrible, right? Because you're taking the imaginary flowers away so that they see the thing that they're trying to protect themselves from. But the point of the intervention is precisely you're doing that not to hurt them, but because you know that really that's the best way for them to break those chains, to work through that trauma so that they can pick living flowers, so that they can engage in activities that are in the world and more rich and enlivening than drinking alcohol, right? So it's a similar kind of structure as when Marx talks about critiquing religion, he's saying, I'm not critiquing something ugly. I'm critiquing something beautiful, but it's almost too beautiful, and it prevents us from really looking at our historical conditions. So Marx has a very subtle series of arguments. One is that you can see in religion the ideals of a society, but also sometimes you can go, it also gives you a way out of the oppression, not in this life, but in the next life, right? So, you can get through this, and then you'll get into a place where we're all equal, we all care for each other, etc., etc. Sorry, my Siri keeps talking to me. It's really annoying. So yes, so where was I? Oh yes, Marx is saying, oh yes, so Joe Hill, who I don't think is in this week. He's in, I sometimes include him in Atheism for Lent, but has a great song that reflects this about the Salvation Army. And he calls them the Starvation Army, because he talks about how the Salvation Army sings songs to the workers when they're coming back from the mines, that in the next life everything will be wonderful. But basically accept what's happening right now. Again, apologies for that. I've got my phone on Do Not Disturb, and somehow I think it must be in your favorite list, those it doesn't stop them from phoning. Very frustrating. Anyway, I'm terrible with technology, good with philosophy sometimes, terrible with technology. Dear help me. Thank you for persevering. Okay, so where was I? Marx and, oh yes, religion as an opiate, as a painkiller, as the imaginary flowers and the chains of our oppression. So again, Marx doesn't have a negative opinion as such of religion here. He just thinks that it's getting in the way of real material transformation of society. It can offer, weirdly, a spiritual liberation that is not material liberation. And Simone de Beauvoir, who is also in this week, there's a little excerpt from The Second Sex where she talks about how religion is oppressive to women. But her argument is very interesting. It's very similar to Marx, because it's not that religion oppresses women by telling them that they're bad or sinful or anything like that. At a deeper level, de Beauvoir is interested in how religion can provide a way for women to express themselves and express certain desires in an acceptable way, a spiritual way. But the problem is then they don't get expressed materially in the real world. So the oppression, again, isn't because, oh, religion is bad. It's partly, oh no, it's actually really good. It kind of offers you a really beautiful utopia and a beautiful fantasy that you can kind of get lost in. An example I like regarding this, but it's a bit dated now, but a brilliant movie called Collateral, where Tom Cruise is an assassin, and I'm sure you've seen it, but if you haven't seen it, definitely see it. It's an incredible movie. And he's an assassin. It's one night, he's traveling around in a taxi with this guy, and he's assassinating people. And the taxi driver has to go with him. And at one point, the taxi driver, he's been fantasizing about not being a taxi driver, owning his own limo company. He's even told his mother that he has it. He's got pictures of the limos that he wants to buy, but he's never done anything to make it happen. And there's a point when the assassin points this out to him and says, basically, like, the dream of the business is the very thing that's stopping you from doing it. You're just sitting there fantasizing, dreaming, and you'll be sitting in this taxi until you're retired, right? That's it. And so the very fantasy of change was the very thing that was keeping him in place. Then we're moving on to, so I mentioned Simone de Beauvoir there. We've also got Jean-Paul Sartre, and an essay, a very famous essay, brilliant essay called Existentialism is a Humanism. And in that argument, he basically says that religion is an attempt to get rid of our freedom. It's horrible to be free. He says we're condemned to freedom. We have to make decisions for ourselves without any guarantee that we're making the right decision. And so often we want to look at tea leaves, and we want to look at tarot cards, and we want to look in the Bible, and we want some authority figure to tell us what to do. And Sartre brilliantly says that there's nothing wrong with that desire as such. That's a desire we have, but you can never escape your freedom. Even if you think God told you something, you still have to interpret it. You still have to interpret that that was God and that wasn't just you having some sort of psychotic break or you were just dreaming or whatever, right? You have to make that decision. There's no way in which you can escape your freedom, but religion can, what he calls, help you enter into bad faith. And bad faith is where you don't take responsibility for your actions, for your freedom, for your life. You want someone else to be responsible for you. So again, with Sartre, there is a sense in which religion arises out of a lack. For him, it's a lack of knowing what we should do. It's a radical freedom, and anxiety is the affect of freedom. So our anxiety arises. For someone like Jean-Paul Sartre, it arises because we don't know what to do. We don't know where we fit in the world. And so to quell the anxiety, we want religion. We want something that will tell us what to do, to kind of allow us to feel we've got guardrails. And Sartre kind of says it's not so much about being right or wrong, it's more fundamentally impossible. It's if you think you've found a way to avoid your freedom, you're living in bad faith. So his critique of religion is at least in this essay, is around that kind of theme. And then Emma Goldman, a great anarchist activist, she sees how religion is used by people in power to keep people enslaved. It's a way to, yes, avoid your freedom. It's a way to give you spiritual satisfaction while keeping you in the worst kind of oppression and violence. And so she has a very strong vitriolic essay to end this week on that theme. But all of these thinkers, as I say, all of them are saying it's very different from week 2, where the critiques are, well, God is a term that is logically inconsistent, or the mind can't get to God, or whatever. It's like that. No, this is about saying the name God is mostly used as a way of covering over our freedom, our lack of knowledge, our helplessness, our experience of not being recognized and loved. Right, there's 4. And that's often how it's used. We can see that empirically. We can look at that. And religion then, in its concrete form, is what we project onto that God. We project ourselves. For Feuerbach, we project the essence of humanity, which we have to critique religion in order to get that back, right? For Marx, it reflects the given epoch, and we have to critique religion so that we can see that and see that different social relations are possible, different ways of being are possible. So, for example, in the hymn "All Things Bright and Beautiful," there's a line, or there's a chorus, or a verse, that says, "The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate." Now, it's a verse that's taken out of most versions now, but that's a way of thinking of religion as a way of justifying the status quo, right? The rich man in his castle, the poor man at his gate, right? God made them high and lowly and ordered their estate. So this is all, it's like a pagan system. This is all balanced. This is all ordered. This is the way it needs to be. And religion then becomes a way of accepting that, seeing that, and at the same time going, and in the next life, the high and the lowly will all be equal, will all be at the table, right? So the dream of every kind of capitalist system is socialism in a way, in heaven, right? So you've got then, as I say, this notion of God arises out of lack. Concrete religion and our concrete notions of God are reflections of our own society, of what we put into that needs to be critiqued in order for us to begin to make real changes in the world. So all these materialists, they're all really interested in real justice in the world, making the place more democratic, and sharing resources better, et cetera, et cetera. And then, yeah, I think that's all I want to say about that bunch. Lack, then, is not the lack of the excess of the mystics, but rather a sense of unknowing, a sense of helplessness, a sense of, fear of our own freedom, because freedom is a lack, right? Because, animals don't fear their freedom, right? They've got instincts. But when you kind of get beyond instinct, into what's called drive, you start to not know what you should do. You know, we don't talk about undog-like dogs or uncat-like cats, but we talk about inhuman humans, right? We talk about, like, as if to be human is to ask the question, what is it to be human? To experience that as a question mark, to not know what it is to do. Therefore, to feel guilty when someone calls and you don't want to answer the phone and they're not in a good place. You go like, oh, what kind of person am I? You know, should I answer the phone or should I not? These are all questions about what is it that I am, who should I be? So this week is all about a type of lack that generates religion, and then concretely what religion looks like is it looks like a version of ourselves, and that we have to realize that, critique it, so that we can make a real difference in the world. So I encourage you to enjoy this week. As always, if there's something you particularly don't like, go into that even more. The things that disturb you are probably the things that will do the most value to you. Try to walk inside these things and avoid critique too early. Even avoid it altogether if you can for this discipline. This is a spiritual discipline, so it's like just allow yourself to feel these and to feel what they're doing in you as you read them, even if it's confusion or unknowing or whatever. I'll just have a quick look to see if there's any questions. Okay, David, first one I see, let me see, is that, yes, where does revelation fit into this journey? Well, interestingly, so for the mystics in the last week, revelation is precisely, yes, the encounter with the truth that is revealed but not conceived. It's a truth that overwhelms. So there's very much an understanding of revelation in the mystics. Here in this week, there is no concept of revelation as such. Everything around, well, except for a revelation of oneself. Right? And that's what Feuerbach is saying. He says, well, revelation is ultimately where religion reveals us to ourselves. But we will come back to revelation because next week is a negation of this week. So, and there's an interesting, I think there's an interesting way of thinking about revelation in each different week. They'll have a different taste. So next week we can maybe talk about revelation because that's the theological existentialists. Levon, hi Levon. How did religion develop for you and what role did it play in your life? Okay, that's a good question. Okay, so I have to say that religion for me initially started like the mystical tradition. I went through a kind of a saturating event when I was 17. It felt overwhelming, saturating, and that began this journey for me. What I would say is that even though that felt like an overwhelming experience, I think that it's still a lacking experience. I think that, so yeah, I guess if you asked me when it happened, it would be like the mystics, but there's something about this week. There's something about the idea that even that is about, oh, something happened to you that you could not understand. And God became a way of feeling that you had control, feeling that you had understanding about something that you were overwhelmed by. And yeah, so you can be overwhelmed by psychotic breaks, by drug experiences, by sleep deprivation. You know, there's various ways in which we can have what might be called a Deleuzean experience, to have a dig at Deleuze, where you kind of like experience this overwhelming feeling. I still think that that comes from lack, but that might take me a while to explain why that is. Like, I think I was a kid who just had no understanding and was overwhelmed by working out, like all teenagers do, you know, where they fit in terms of differentiating from their family life, and religion became a way to separate me from my family in order to kind of find my own way, et cetera, et cetera. So, sorry, that's a waffly answer. Don't think that gave you any insight, but that was a good question. Thank you. Marx comments, I see religion and ideology as both the same, both function to cover up our alienation. I think, Mark, you're absolutely right. Yeah, Mark's making the point there that, and funnily, idolatry and ideology come from the same root of eidos, if I'm correct. And eidos meaning the essence of. So idolatry is like when you think that you've captured the essence of God in a physical thing, and ideology, the truth in your conceptual apparatus. But basically, I think the best understanding of ideology is that ideology is what covers over the cracks, covers over the problems in one society, gives you justifications for things, gives you excuses for things, gives you a way to kind of like it puts the imaginary flowers in the chains of your oppression. That's what ideology does. So, and religion, from the perspective of this week, most of these thinkers are saying, yeah, religion's the same kind of thing. And to some extent, we may need ideology and religion to some extent. That might be a part of what it is to be human, to have society, to be able to have civilization. But also, there has to be ideology critique and religion critique. And that's what all these thinkers are bringing in. And Marx is obviously one of the most important critics of ideology. And yes, he sees very much religion and ideology as cut from the same cloth. He says basically, in fact, the thing you're going to read, he says the critique of religion is the beginning of all critique. He says start by critiquing religion. When you get your teeth into that, then you get into ideology in general, because they're basically cut from the same cloth. All right. Oh yeah, Marcus, one more comment I would like to read. My religious experience was an overwhelming love. That thinking about it now, love is the unknown. It defines something that cannot be fully defined. Yeah, Mark, you're saying that better than I said it. Is that I had the same thing. Like, there was a sense of being overwhelmed, and with love and gratitude and all of that. But as you say, love is precisely a type of embrace of the unknown in the other. So when you love someone, you don't just like their identity, all the things, they're funny, they're attractive, they're this or they're that. In love, you also like their symptom. You also like the dimension of their desire, the part of them that is not identifiable in some sort of material thing. So love is always connected with lack. That will become more clear in future weeks. But so yeah, in the same way that I think religion feels overwhelming, a religious experience feels overwhelming, precisely because it's such a good way of erasing very deep experiences of, as I say, helplessness, very deep experiences of ignorance, very deep experiences of the horror of freedom. And so it can feel very enlivening, but it still comes from a kind of lack. Okay, hopefully that all makes sense. What I would like to do is just always in every seminar go, okay, I've talked for an hour, that's great, but just remember one thing. The one thing to remember is for these types of thinkers, God arises as a blanket to put over some sort of failure, some sort of lack. And what we then project onto that blanket is a reflection of society and ourselves writ large. We are alienated from our own selves by putting it out there. But that if we can start to critique what is out there in religion, then we can begin to, for Feuerbach, understand our human essence, for Marx, be able to critique society, etc., etc. Anyway, lovely to chat with you all. I hope you enjoy this week. I'll be seeing some of you in about 4 weeks' time for Wake, right here where I'm living. There'll be like 70 of us all hanging out. I cannot wait to do that. And I will see you